of Bio 101. Since this is a hybrid course, your lectures are going to be recorded for you and placed on your Moodle classroom. Obviously, you know that because you found the first one, but I just wanted to reiterate that there will not be lecture in class. However, during the first part of class, we will be going through some questions. We'll go over the material that was discussed in the lecture for that particular week. So you want to make sure that you've done the lecture ahead of time. One thing that I would recommend is that perhaps you print out the lecture as a handout, 2 per slide or something like that. Have it with you when you are going through the lecture, and that way you can just jot some notes on there. I think that will help to bring the information that I bring out, what I find to be important and what you have read in your textbook might be helpful for you. So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit. First, I want to mention the way that this course is set up. This is a biology class. It gives you biology credit. If you are a non-science major. The thing I like about this particular course is that it takes things that we have experience with or that we see in the world around us, and it brings home the biology concepts that are underlying in those things. So I think that we are going to find this to be an interesting way to study biology. We're going to start out with energy drinks, but we're going to be talking about things that range from cancer and the flu to GMOs and climate change, lots of different things in our world that we experience, and it looks at the science behind it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the first lecture. Our first section or first module that we're going to be covering is called energy drinks. I don't know how many of you have actually tried an energy drink. It's something that if you want to look at the science of it, you're going to ask yourself, does it have energy in it? Or does it just give me energy in some way? Or is it even a false sense of energy? So we're going to kind of cover some of those things. But before we can get too far into that, I think we have to ask the question, what is energy? So your textbook kind of starts out talking about energy. Energy really is the ability to do work. I kind of, in my physics class or in some of my other classes, I'll say that, if you have a big boulder in the middle of the road and you start pushing on it and pushing on it and pushing on it, and it doesn't move, did you really do work? And the answer is no. Well, you didn't do work on the rock. Your muscles felt like they did a lot of work, but you didn't achieve movement. And work involves movement. So when we talk about energy, it's ability to put something into movement. What does that mean? Well, that's varying depending on what kind of energy we're talking about. So your textbook breaks energy down into 3 kinds of energy that we see in the world or experience. The first one is solar energy. Obviously, you feel that when you're out on a beach and the sun is beating down on you and it's kind of warming you up. That heat, that warmth that you're experiencing is a result of energy that is being emitted by the sun. So plants use solar energy. They take in that energy from the sun. They use it and combine it with carbon dioxide that they take out of the air, and they make sugars or glucose, which is energy for the cells to be able to do what they need to do. That's a process called photosynthesis. You probably heard about that. We'll talk more about that later, but I just wanted to kind of point that out. That is using solar energy, but what they actually are doing there is converting that solar energy into a chemical energy because they are making sugar. So chemical energy is our second kind of energy, and that energy is actually stored in the bonds of the atoms that are linked together. So as you break those bonds, you are releasing the energy. If you are building bonds, it's going to require energy. So the energy from the solar helps them to build the bonds to make the chemical sugar or glucose, and then that glucose is broken down by the plant in order to sustain the life within the cells. So we'll talk more about that. The third kind of energy that we tend to think about or talk about is called mechanical energy. Mechanical just means relating to movement. So when we think of mechanical energy, we oftentimes will break it down into two different kinds. If it's in motion, we're going to call it kinetic energy. It's being moved from one place to another. You throw a ball, it has kinetic energy because you put some force behind it, and so it's actually moving. In our diagram on our screen here, it shows an apple falling out of a tree. Obviously, that is a kinetic energy. My bad, I just changed the slides. So anyway, energy then can either be kinetic or potential. I'm not going to go back in slides, but I will just finish up saying that the potential energy is energy that could be used. So if you think of, oftentimes the example is a ball sitting on the top of a hill or a rock sitting on top of the hill, but it's not moving. If you give it a little bit of input, then it starts to roll down the hill. So that means it's got potential energy, but it becomes kinetic energy as it's put into motion. I want to go on and talk about a couple of definitions that I think we need to make sure that we understand, probably in your high school and junior high, and maybe even in grade school. You talked about the scientific method. And the scientific method is just a means or a way to ask a question, to analyze a process, to make a hypothesis about something. As you do that, as you use the scientific method, you're going to develop what you call a theory. A theory just is based on some facts. You can repeat the experiment. It does the same thing every time. And so we give it the term a theory. Sometimes you'll hear about the term a scientific law. A scientific law is a way to describe something that is seen in nature. It shows itself to be the same every single time. So when you throw a ball up, it is going to come down. That's the law of gravity. There are some laws that are related to energy that I want to talk about. Sometimes we call these the laws of thermodynamics. If you had a high school physical science or a chemistry course, they may have talked about this. The first law of thermodynamics is one that says energy can't be created or destroyed, but it can be changed. It can be changed into different forms. So the energy that we just talked about in the last slide, depending on what kind of energy, we already mentioned solar energy was taken in by plants. It was converted, it was changed or transformed into a chemical energy in the form of glucose. So we can't make new energy. So you're like, well, wait a minute, we have a generator, right? We use a generator to make energy, but that's actually taking energy from some other source. It might be a water wheel, it might be something else. It's taking that energy, it's converting it into electrical energy, which is something that we need or use. So the second law of thermodynamics, it's still talking about this energy, but it says that when we convert the energy, when we change it from one form to the next, there is never 100% movement of that energy. There's always going to be a loss, and that loss is called heat more often than not. If you look at your furnace or you look at any electrical device, your refrigerators, the different things like that, they'll talk about energy efficiency. How much of the energy that you put in is actually used to do the job, like cool your food in the refrigerator. If you ever stand behind your refrigerator, you'll notice that it gives off a fair amount of heat as it's cooling things inside the box. So there is a loss of heat in that particular system. So that's true in any form. That loss of energy is often talked about as going from order to disorder. Things don't tend to stay perfectly orderly. Things will go from order to disorder. We use the term entropy in science to describe that. So if things become more disordered, then we're going to say that the entropy is increasing. All right, so let's bring it down to the energy then that all living cells use is probably a term that you've heard before that is called ATP. And ATP is adenosine triphosphate. That's the name of the chemical, adenosine triphosphate. Well, what does that look like? Chemically speaking, it has some type of an amine ending chemically. It has a sugar called a ribose, and it has three phosphates, triphosphate, right? So it has three phosphates attached. This is what a cell uses to create an energy because chemical changes are what are driving the energy inside a cell. So it's important to remember. So ATP, at least I know I drive it home a lot in my high school classes, that this is the energy that we use in our cells. Now, we take glucose when we bring it in and we convert it into ATP through a process that we'll talk about later in this class. But I just want to bring home the understanding that these phosphates are where the energy is. Remember, I mentioned that in a chemical energy, the energy is actually stored within the bonds. These three phosphates are negatively charged elements in this whole structure. And what do we know when you put a negative magnet next to a negative pole of another magnet? Do they want to stick together? No, they don't. These phosphates they want to repel against each other. They are stuck together. They are bonded together in our ATP, but they don't like it. There's a lot of energy located in these bonds between them. So if we can find a way, and our cells do this naturally, to free this one phosphate or free a phosphate off from here, it's going to release a ton of energy. So if we think about our food, we eat food, we bring it in, it's converted into glucose inside the cell. That glucose gets changed into ATP. Now this is the energy that's available to the cell in order to do some work or to run whatever process it happens to need to do. So that ATP then is going to come in, and the way that it releases that energy is it kicks off one of the phosphates and it creates a second compound called ADP. So if tri-TP was triphosphate, D is di, so ADP is adenosine diphosphate, and it frees a phosphate. As it does that, then this is the chemical structure if you want to look at that. As it releases that phosphate, it's also releasing a ton of energy, and that's what the cell uses then in order to do the functions that it needs to do. So as we talk about energy and how that relates to life, so let's look at what happens in energy that is being used by living things. Biology is the study of life, so we're going to be talking about living things. So in our earlier discussion, we mentioned that solar energy is taken in by plants and it is converted or changed into chemical energy. And we can see that in our diagram here. We have the chloroplasts, which are structures inside the plants, and those chloroplasts will change the solar energy down into a chemical energy called the carbohydrate. And that carbohydrate then is the sugar molecule that we use in order to make the ATP energy. Well, this happens down inside of a cell. So that cell will take in the ATP, or will take in the glucose. That glucose gets broken down in a structure inside the cell. And we haven't really talked about cell structures yet, but we'll also cover a little bit of that. You might have heard, though, of the mitochondria. Sometimes in my classes, we call them the mighty mitochondria. Because these are the ones that are creating that ATP. They are creating that energy that the cells need in order to do the different functions that they have. So the mitochondria is the place we call the process, and we'll get to this again later, cellular respiration. And that's not breathing, that's actually converting our sugars into the ATP form of energy that the cells can use to do chemical work. They can transport things, they can do mechanical work, they can move things, they can build things, they can make proteins. They can do a lot of things that a cell needs to do, and so that is the use of the energy. So let's go on now and step back out just a little bit and look at a larger view of what energy is and taken in by living things. So in living organisms, not plants in particular, but in living organisms, we are going to take in nutrients from other things. Obviously, the plants take it in from the solar energy, but we tend to take in uh, molecules. We don't eat ATP per se. We eat a hamburger, right? Or we eat a salad. We eat something that has energy stored in the chemicals within it, and then we convert that into the energy that our cells need. So if we think about it in that regard, we talk about molecules that provide energy for living things, and we talk about what we call nutrients, things that we need for our bodies to function. Now, most of the nutrients that we talk about are organic nutrients, but what does that word mean, organic? Organic is not uh, what you think of when you go into the grocery store and you pay extra money for something to be organically grown. Maybe you're getting some vegetables and they have not been grown with pesticides on them and they label that as organic. Or maybe you buy some eggs in the dairy section and you're getting eggs that have been free from free-range chickens and they'll call them organic because it's more natural. Organic doesn't really mean natural in a chemical sense. What it means is that it has carbon and hydrogen inside it. So when we see the word organic, uh, hopefully we can start thinking something that contains carbon and hydrogen. All right, so most of our organic nutrients will have carbon and hydrogen, and then they will also have functional groups attached to them. These are the chemical speaking, right? So we have carbons, and they may be linked together like a sugar, and they have hydrogens bonded to them, right? So it's a carbon-hydrogen uh, molecule, and then this hydrogen, or I'm sorry, this molecule might have a functional group. Sometimes we'll use the letter R to designate a functional group. It might be a hydroxide, it might be some carboxyl group, lots of different things that are on there. That functional group, that R group, really tells what kind of reactivity that compound is going to have in function. So organic molecules have a carbon, hydrogen, typically a functional group that kind of helps to drive what their job is. A couple things that we talk about is that oftentimes these functional, or not functional groups, but these carbon compounds will be connected together. And so we use the term polymer to talk about them connected together. Suppose I have a glucose, right? And these are circles are representing glucose molecules, and they are connected together to make a chain. That whole chain is called a polymer. If you talk about just a single glucose molecule, that's going to be called a monomer. So a polymer is just monomers all linked together. But how do they get linked together? Well, this is what these two processes here talk about. Dehydration, synthesis. All right, so synthesis is making, dehydration is removing water. If you've ever dehydrated meat to make jerky or dehydrated fruit to make a snack for later, those are ways of pulling water out. And that's how we actually build these links to hold these things together. A water molecule gets removed, and then it is able to link those two things together. So creation of a polymer from a monomer is done usually through a dehydration process or dehydration synthesis. Now the opposite then of that is true. We can use a process called hydrolysis in order to break these links. So if I have a polymer and I introduce if I introduce a water into my system, it's going to break the bonds in here and it's going to add hydrogens and oxygens on here, and it's going to be breaking apart into smaller polymers or even down into a single monomer. So hydrolysis is the way of breaking that apart. Hydro means water, lysis means break. So those are two new terms perhaps for you, but it's going to be something that we're going to talk about when we look at nutrients and organic molecules. I gave you a couple of examples of organic molecules and what they look like, and this slide just shows us some of what those could look like. There's lots of different shapes and structures for them. Here is a 4-carbon chain with the hydrogen bonds on it. Here is a 4-carbon chain with hydrogen bonds, and then it has a branch to it, another carbon branching off. So these molecules can be in a straight chain. They can be branched. Sometimes they can be held together in a cyclical manner where here, this is a ribose. These 5 carbons are bonded together, and then they have hydrogens filling them on the outside. Sometimes we'll just draw these things. Here's a 6-carbon. This is actually glucose. Sometimes we will draw these things using a shorthand method. It just means that each of these points, each of these corners are carbons, but it's just a quicker, easier way to draw the compound. So when you see something like this, these are the organic molecules. Now I said that they have functional groups that are attached to them. Remember, we could have a carbon, and maybe one of these has some hydrogens. In chemistry, you have to learn about the balance of how all of the electrons need to be, valence electrons need to be balanced with each other, but we're not going to worry about that. This one has an R group coming off the side. So it has 4 things bonded to the carbon because carbon needs 4 things. That could be just a hydroxyl group, oxygen and a hydrogen. It could be a carbonyl group. It has a carbon with 2 oxygens and a hydrogen. It could be an amine group with a nitrogen. If you see an N, the word amine, think about N, it's going to have a nitrogen located somewhere in there. Our proteins have nitrogens. They're amino acids because they have nitrogens in them. Sulfhydryl group has a sulfur in it. Phosphate, which we talked about on our ATP, is going to have a phosphorus, and then it's going to have hydroxides, oxygens, and hydrogens associated with that as well. So I guess that's just hydrogen. So those are going to be what we talk about when we say functional groups. You don't need to know a ton of this stuff, but this is more for your understanding. So let's talk about the process of linking our monomers together to make polymers. So dehydration, removal of water, synthesis, building a polymer from a monomer, right? So, or maybe you're building smaller polymers together and making a big chain. So if we take a look at that, essentially what you're seeing, if you look on here, what is the chemical formula for water? H2O. Here we are pulling a hydroxy and a hydrogen off from 2 different monomers, and that links them together. So we're moving the water, so now they are linked by an oxygen bond in between them. Right? And in the process, they are going to release water as a result. So that is the dehydration synthesis. Hydrolysis is just the opposite. So we have this polymer from down here with the oxygens holding them together. We introduce a water. That water then will come in and it will insert itself where that oxygen is and will create a break in our chain of the polymers and break it off into monomers or maybe just smaller polymers. So that's kind of the way that happens. But let's talk about some more actual food molecules. We'll use this concept to come in and explain these. So when we talk about nutrients, a lot of times We'll talk about macronutrients and micronutrients. Maybe you learned this in a health class, or you've just heard about it, or maybe you're interested in food facts or information. And so you'll look at the nutrients that are listed on a food label. And we're going to do something with food labels a little bit later. So when we look at organic nutrients, we can break them down into three classes that are used for energy, but there are four groups of organic nutrients. So we have carbohydrates, we have fats, we have proteins, and we have nucleic acids. These are not used for energy, but we're still going to mention them here. So a carbohydrate, if we think about them, these are sugars, right? So most of us like to eat our carbs. They have sugars. These are the easiest form of energy for your body to use because it already is just chains of sugars together. So saccharide means sweet or sugar. So these are linked to get together. Mono means a single one, right? So a glucose molecule, which I already drew, I can't draw now. That's a ribose. A glucose molecule is a monosaccharide. So glucose is an example of a monosaccharide. It's just one sugar molecule. If we link them together, we create what we call polysaccharides. Now, polysaccharides can be disaccharides, like table sugar, sucrose is a disaccharide. It's two linked together, two glucose or two molecules, simple molecules, monosaccharides linked together. Or you can have polysaccharides. You can have big chains, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about these in a few minutes. Fats are our other group of nutrients, macronutrients. These aren't really monomers and polymers. These are made from glycerol and fatty acids and a triglyceride. We'll talk about all of these in just a minute. Proteins are also monomers and polymers. The monomer is called an amino acid. All right, so an amino acid has a certain chemical structure. When they get linked together, we call them polypeptides. So polypeptide amino acids linked are called polypeptides. They make up a certain structure or chain, and they become known as proteins. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about those as well. Nucleic acids, like I said, are not used for energy, but they are what makes up our ATP, the adenine in there, and they make up RNA, they make up DNA, which is your code telling you everything about you. So that's contained in the nucleus of all of our cells. RNA is used to convert that code into a protein. So which is something that many of our cells have to do to make proteins to do different things for us. So that's kind of a general overview, but let's take a look at each of those individually. So let's go to carbohydrates first. So here are a group of some monosaccharides. Fructose, you're going to find this kind of a sugar in fruit. Glucose is the basic sugar that we use at our cells, and galactose is also another monosaccharide. Each of these three can be bonded together. We can get things like sucrose, which is a disaccharide, that's glucose, and fructose bonded together. Lactose is found in milk. That's the milk sugar. Glucose and galactose bonded together. And maltose and malts are a combination of two glucose molecules bonded to each other. So these are our carbohydrates, and those are important things that we like to consume. They're sweet, they taste good, you get your nice sweetening in your fruit, and they also provide the carbohydrates, the sugars that our cells need to convert into what? Into ATP. Now, carbohydrates can be linked more than just two. We can have a polysaccharide. Here is one polysaccharide that we call starch. So starches are links of several monosaccharides put together, and these are going to be found in plants. Starches come from plants. All right, it's a sugar that is built together by plants. It's for us, or for even the plant, it's more of a long-term storage. We don't have we can't use a whole chain. We have to break things down into the monomers, glucose, because that's the form of energy that our cells use. So we have to break it down into the monomer glucose. What was the process? Do you remember? I'm testing you just to think about it. What process breaks it? It is hydrolysis, right? Hydrolysis, breaking down that chain by adding what? Adding water. Okay, so we have a chain of glucose. This is a good source of energy for our cells. It can break starches down pretty easily. The chemical process involved in that is fairly simple. And so in a plant, this is often a long-term storage. In animals, the polysaccharide of carbohydrates is called glycogen. Again, it's still linking of glucose molecules of simple sugars linked together, but it looks just a little bit different. This is used as a energy storage also, but usually it's a short-term storage, right? Short-term storage within our cells. So we can convert them in our cells to a short-term storage called glycogen. And we'll talk more about this again later as well. But if we think about this, you eat a meal, right? And your body's taking all of that food that you've brought in, and it's converting that food through our digestive process into glucose. Right? Glucose is that sugar that our cells use to make energy. That glucose then goes throughout our body in our blood system, right? The blood is carrying it throughout our body. So our body has an ability to measure its blood sugar levels. And as the blood sugar level increases because we're eating, or we are eating, or we've eaten a big meal, our blood sugar level is going to increase and we have more sugar than we need. So our body then will convert that sugar into our short-term glycogen, which then gets stored in our cells, and it's held there until maybe 2-3 hours after you've eaten. Your blood sugar level is starting to drop, right? And as that blood sugar level drops, your cells' needs for sugar doesn't change. They still have a high need for sugar, and so they can dip into this glycogen storage that is found within the cells, breaking that glycogen back down into glucose that is then useful and emptied into your bloodstream. If you think about it, sometimes maybe you're starting to feel hungry a couple hours after you've had a meal, and you're like, oh man, I'm getting so hungry. That's because your blood sugar level is dropping. And if you wait, say 20 minutes or so, your liver is going to start converting that glycogen that it's already stored from the last big meal into glucose, and you're going to find that that feeling of hunger is going to pass because now your cells are getting the blood sugar, the energy that it needs. So we have for our carbohydrates, we have our simple sugars, right? We have our disaccharides, we have our polysaccharides, starches in plants, glycogen in animals. Kind of polysaccharide that I want to talk about is called a lot of times we call it fiber or cellulose. Cellulose is more of the chemical term, but we talk about fibers in the foods that we eat. It's something that comes from the cell wall of plants. The cell walls are made from cellulose. That's where the word cell comes from. Ose is a sugar, right? So cellulose is plant cell wall sugars. It's what gives that sugar the structure to be able to grow tall, since they don't have bones like we do, right? And so when we eat plants, we are going to be taking in the starches that they had, and then we are also taking in the fibers. We can't digest fiber, but it still has a very important thing for us in digestion. We can't break cellulose down into energy, so we cannot break these bonds down into a usable form of glucose for us. But what we do is that fiber provides the ability to move things within our digestive system. So it helps move food through our digestive tract. It will also be used to decrease. We've found that it's used to decrease breast cancer. It's been found to decrease colon cancer. If we don't keep those toxic things from our food stuff in the colon very long, it helps to decrease the ability or the chances of a colon cancer happening. The other thing that it does is as it passes through the digestive system, it pulls cholesterol out. And well, I spelled that wrong. While we have need of cholesterol for some things in our cells, we tend to take in too much. And so it's able to help pull that excess cholesterol out and help manage our blood levels of cholesterol. So as you can see, there are lots of different kinds of carbohydrates and lots of um, uses and abilities for them to be needed. That's why they're a macronutrient in our body. Now, in your textbook, they break out a little subsection. We hear a lot more things about gluten nowadays because it's something that we've learned to understand. People that you may know, or you may be one of those people that has something called celiac disease, or maybe it's just a gluten sensitivity. Maybe you're not really full-blown celiac, but you have a sensitivity to it. And so let's talk just for a brief minute. I can't spell sensitivity right now. Let's talk for a brief minute about what gluten is. Gluten is actually a protein. It's not a carbohydrate, but we're going to talk about that here because it's in a lot of the things that we eat to get carbohydrates. It's a protein that's found in grains of cereals. So wheat, things like that, barley, they can have a protein in it called gluten. People that have a problem called celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease, they respond to that gluten when you ingest it, and it actually starts to destroy the lining of that small intestine. And so, consumption of gluten, that protein, causes digestive issues in people that have celiac disease. So again, it's not a carbohydrate, but because it's a part of wheats and things that have carbohydrates in, people that have a gluten sensitivity may avoid gluten, or now there are more and more products coming out on the market that are what we call gluten-free. That protein has been removed. If you wanted to experiment to see what that gluten protein looks like, you could actually take and make a dough with some wheat flour, add some water, make a nice dough to it, and then you could place it into a strainer, and you could rinse the uh, dough with some running water, and you're going to be left with a gelatinous mass in the bottom of that, and that's actually the protein, gluten. So that was an aside that was put in there. Let's move back into our macronutrients. Now, I said that lipids were not really monomers and polymers. That's because they are made out of couple of things. They're made out of, they have a glycerol, which is a three carbon chain, and they have three fatty acids that are attached to it. A lipid really is classified as a triglyceride, right? They have a glycerol, and they have three fatty acids. Now, triglycerides, or fatty acids, I'm sorry, can be used for energy storage. There's lots of carbons in here, right? So you see all these carbons in here, and we know that our bodies, our cells are designed to take carbons and break them down. But it takes a little bit more work. The chemical process is not the same. So it's a long-term storage of energy for our cells or our bodies. And so we will create fat, which is the lipid, dietary fat, and they will store it within our body in our adipose cells to be used as energy if we don't have enough carbohydrates to do the job for us. So when we talk about triglycerides, sometimes you'll see terms like, or if you talk about fats, we'll talk about saturated and unsaturated fats. So I wanted to just explain what that looks like here. In a saturated fat, you are going to see lots of straight chains. These straight chains happen because they are single bonds. They have all of their spaces filled with hydrogens, and so they create a straight chain. Our animal fats are usually saturated triglycerides. So you cook some bacon on the stovetop, or you're cooking a hamburger and you get that grease left in the pan afterwards, but as that comes down to room temperature, it's going to turn into a solid because those straight chains can just line up very nicely on top of each other and become solid. So when we think about saturated fats, they are typically solid at room temperature. So again, animal fats, butter, lard, those types of things are all considered a saturated fat. Now, our oils are unsaturated fats. Unsaturated means that there happens to be some double bonds located inside them. So our carbons, some of them are double bonded. And what happens is that tends to give the chain a bent shape. Right? So now these structures have bends to them, and as they stack up, they don't compact very well, and so they remain liquids at room temperatures. So you're going to find these in your oils. These are usually animal fats, so your canola oil, your vegetable oil, things like that. So as we relate this to health, sometimes what you'll see is they will ask you to avoid saturated fats. There's a higher correlation between heart disease and the consumption of saturated fats. So rather than using butter, they ask you to use oil in your cooking and things like that. So just like with our carbohydrates, we talked about different types. We had different lengths of chains of polysaccharides, and those polysaccharides might be cellulose or some of these starches, those types of things. In our lipids, we also have different types depending on the chain. So we just talked about the triglycerides, but another kind of lipid that we have is called a phospholipid. Phospholipid is found in the cell membranes. It's a very important structure. So in our cell membrane, a phospholipid, this is an example of a phospholipid. Here is our glycerol, right? But instead of having instead of having three uh, chains on them, three fatty acid chains, it only has two. It has a saturated fatty acid chain and it has an unsaturated, right? These double bonds which add a kink to it. Now, this phospholipid, and we'll talk about cell membranes down the road, but they are very important in building up the membrane, the wall of your cell, because phospholipids are not water loving. And inside your cell is a water environment. So we have a lot of water in our cytoplasm, right? We also have a lot of water outside our cell. And a phospholipid is not water loving, so it creates a barrier, right? So that the water outside and inside can be regulated. So what this does is it makes a cell membrane what we call selectively permeable, because there are things in it that don't allow the water to come in, that phospholipid. Another source of lipids that we have in our cells or in our bodies are steroids. We create these, our sex hormones, our steroids. Uh, they are very useful and needed for survival and function of our body, but they come from lipids. The chemical structure comes from a lipid, so they're important in the synthesis or the making of steroids in our body. There are other steroids that we have too as well that come from this same lipid base. Cholesterol is another one of those that comes from a lipid. It helps us to maintain our fluid compartments. Cholesterol you're going to find embedded in our cell membranes, and they are going to help with maintaining that cell membrane. So that's an important function of cholesterol. So again, I've said this before, but cholesterol is not always a bad guy. It has an important function within our cell. It's just that we consume too much of it, and so it can also block our arteries and veins. Okay, so our third macronutrient that we're going to talk about here are um, proteins. We need to consume proteins in a fairly large amount. Remember, these do have polymers. They have a polypeptide chain of amino acids. The monomer is an amino acid. It has an amine group to it, has a carboxyl group to it, and it has an R. Remember, R are different chemical structures that R group tells you what kind of amino acid it is. So if we have 20 different possible R groups, then that means we have 20 amino acids that can be used by our body to create protein chains. All right, so those protein chains, polypeptide or peptide chains, those protein chains have different functions in our body. So we have hormones that are made out of proteins. We have muscles that are made out of proteins. We have enzymes that are made out of proteins. So one of the things that our body does a lot is make proteins. They're typically not used for energy. You can see there are some carbons in here, so it's not totally impossible for them to use for energy. They just aren't preferred. All right, so the cells usually use these to build this other stuff that it might need. So it can be broken down into energy, but usually that's a last resort by your body. So if we talk about proteins and building them amino acids together, so here is a monomer, right? A single amino acid. That monomer is added to a second monomer. They are combining through that same process that we talked about, dehydration. We're pulling out a water to create a peptide bond. And here's the example, and it's joining those together. So now that amino acid, those two amino acids create what we call a dipeptide or a peptide, start of a peptide chain and an additional water. So that whole concept, again, that we've already talked about, dehydration synthesis. Now, proteins can be organized into four different levels or four categories. We sometimes talk about primary structure, and that's just that chain, right? So that whole chain of those polypeptides or those amino acids bonded together is called the primary structure of a protein. Now, we have a lot of proteins in our body. These chains, because they can get so long, they start to, between the amino acids, they start to form bonds. And as they form bonds, we call that the secondary structure. These are hydrogen bonds between those amino acids, and a hydrogen bond is relatively weak, but it helps to hold them together. And what it does is it drives the change in that chain into two different structures. We can have a helical structure, or we can have what we call pleated sheets. And so these are just two different structures that these can actually start to look like. So those are what we would call the secondary structure. They continue to bond. Remember we said that there's an R group in there. These are the different chemical structures for the specific amino acids, and they can actually start to bond with each other. Now, they're not hydrogen bonds, it's a little bit stronger bonding between those chemicals, and it gives what we call the tertiary structure. They start to kind of bend and bond to each other. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. Proteins, as they bond, are going to change shape. Right? So if you think about that, that makes sense. But it's also going to help to give the function of the protein. So both the tertiary and the quaternary structure, which I'll talk about in a second, is where we would call the functional aspect of the protein, because now it can actually do something. What do we mean by do something? Well, if you think about a protein that's used as a channel through a membrane, uh, now if something binds that protein, it's going to change shape. And if it changes shape, it might allow something to enter the cell. I used the term selective permeability in the last slide. It might allow something to happen in the cell that now allows glucose or something to enter into the cell. So this is where the function comes in on the proteins. So the tertiary is bonding of the R groups, and then if you get multiple proteins bonded together, an example might be hemoglobin, which is a protein found in your red blood cells, and that's going to be used for binding oxygen. It takes on what we call the quaternary structure. In hemoglobin, it allows iron, it allows oxygen, the iron in there, allows oxygen to bind to it, and it will change shape in order to carry oxygen to your body. So that's just an example of a quaternary structure of a protein. This is an introduction to the macronutrients, the things that we need by our body. We kind of covered the processes to building polymers out of monomers. That's useful in carbohydrates. That's useful in proteins. Lipids are different. They're still a macronutrient, but the way that they form and bond together is not really polymer monomer type thing. So they're slightly different. So hopefully this is helpful to you, and it's kind of helped reinforce some of the things that you have read about. And I look forward to seeing you